Project Lawful aka Planecrash by Arwayne aka Eliezer Yudkowsky and Lintamande. What the Truth Can Destroy. Episode 160.
Fenalosa will head on over, or at least appear to. It's a very big library, much larger than the one in the Archduke's villa, much larger than the one in the palace. The illusionist is drawing somewhat on the library in the Temple of the All-Seeing Eye, which is even bigger, but this one is credibly big. Some levitating wizards are in midair, paging through books too high to reach without the ability to fly. He asks some people where to find Chelish history specifically. He's told it's a whole section over there in the back, behind Taldor and to the left of the River Kingdoms. "All right," he says tiredly to Keltham on reaching it. "Do I start pulling out books at prime intervals and ripping out the 18th page of each, or what?"
"Is that allowed, or does it cause you to get arrested? I would sort of expect the arrested thing."
"That will definitely get me fined an enormous sum of money. I wouldn't expect to be arrested so long as I pay it."
Ripping out pages is entirely pointless. Once Keltham has seen that page, Fenalosa taking it home with him doesn't add to the amount of information the conspiracy has to create. Can we borrow or buy books?
"We can commission a copy of any book for delivery later this week, which I assume is unsatisfactory to you, and buy or borrow them on the spot if the library already has 2 copies, which I was told was the case for most of the more popular books and a majority of the recent ones. I assume you didn't want to look at old books anyway."
Noticeably better than expected. All right, and does this section of the library have a living library index, person who knows which books contain what information and can tell us if we ask them?
"Fenalosa will go track down someone who appears to work here and ask."
The answer is yes. Each section has a responsible party at the Academy who makes all decisions about acquisitions for that section. The Chelish section is supervised by Tono Berlinguer, a retired Chelish military intelligence specialist who, it happens, reconsidered his retirement when Nidal attacked Cheliax and has taken a leave of absence from the Academy to lend himself to the war effort.
"I assume you want us to go and get him?"
Yes, Keltham says, after reminding himself of how scared and worried he is in fact feeling, and forcibly overriding a huge amount of internal reluctance to impose inconveniences upon others, of which it was said once that if Dathilan were ever to be destroyed, it would probably be because of somebody's reluctance to inconvenience others, and meanwhile, because Keltham obviously isn't going to wait for that, he's going to try going through these books. Question 1. What exactly happened when Abigail Thrune took over? What were the details of that fight? Who died, and why didn't they just come back the next day? What changes did the church make immediately after coming to power? If the books say it was all very pretty, Keltham has now been in Golarion longer than a day, and has seen a slave market for upwards of several seconds.
Corva has been in emergency overdrive from the moment that Keltham first requested books from Ione, and has been commanding a small army of Chelish writers for at least the past half hour. She's fully aware that she has been given a task that it is not actually possible to do well. It's also a task that the entire project could succeed or fail on, and if the result is a failure, then she's not exactly going to expect to live a long life afterwards, no matter what the Queen has said to her about how incredibly safe she supposedly is. Whether she lives or dies is then, once again, quite possibly up to Keltham. At this speed and this volume, a few missteps are absolutely inevitable, and Keltham, if he really cares enough to win this, should be able to find them. If Keltham doesn't catch whatever the mistakes happen to be, and she obviously doesn't know what they are, or she'd have fixed them, it's his own damn fault. Under other circumstances, she would probably be freaking out about all of that, but at the moment she is trying really, really hard to completely ignore her emotions and act as a conductor for this entire ridiculous venture. She has books. Well, pieces of them. Resulting conflict plunged the nation into a further 2 years of civil war, although much of the later fighting was contained to the province of Ravunel, where Infrexus Thrune had maintained a more significant base of political power, which continued to push for the recovery of Infrexus's remains. Throughout this time, there was also continued conflict on the border with Galt, primarily consisting of a series of skirmishes between ill-equipped military forces and local militia fighters, although some have asserted that such skirmishes were a deliberate expansionist attempt by Galt. The pattern is more honestly understood as a result of underpolicing of the region by the Chelish military, which was otherwise engaged at the time. The smoldering ashes of conflict between Galt and Cheliax during this time are generally excluded from the casualty estimates given for the War of the Succession of Queen Abigail, as that fighting, though concurrent and related, was between Chelish and Galton forces rather than the supporters of Queen Abigail and the supporters of Infrexus Thrune. As regards the Succession War itself, estimates of the total death toll range from 2,000 to 6,000. With the majority of these casualties, as is so often the case, coming from the diseases which soldiers were subjected to during the campaign to retake Ravunel. Igorian itself saw real conflict only a few times, much of it in the immediate aftermath of the coup against Infrexus. Although Infrexus's taxation policies and loss of the eastern provinces of Galt and Andorran had made him wildly unpopular, there were many at the time who believed that his niece, the rightful heir to the throne by law, was too young to rule responsibly, having celebrated her 16th birthday not 3 months before. Despite the full support of the Asmodean Church, the first year of the young Queen Abigail Thrune's reign was marked by a series of unsuccessful assassination attempts by everyone from Eastern revolutionary agents to a small band of extremists who intended to resurrect the previous queen, Karelia. The most notorious of these early assassination attempts may have been the incident on the 10th of Aradus in 4709 AR, in which a band of Galton agents disguised as members of the Queen's own guard managed to infiltrate the interior of the palace walls before being caught. It is difficult to say whether a successful early assassination attempt might have spelled doom for the young Queen's reign, or what might have become of the nation of Cheliax afterwards. Certainly, if the Queen were to die now, her resurrection would be almost immediate and have no bearing on her legitimacy. However, at the time of her coronation, the Queen's success depended not only on the military might of her Asmodean supporters, but on whether she could earn the support of the nation at large. As the demise of her predecessor had so recently proven, the leadership of the nation of Cheliax would depend not only on her unquestionable legal right to rule, but also on whether she could earn the respect and loyalty of the forces which ostensibly answered to her, while it is likely that the Church of Asmodeus would have recovered her remains and restored her rightful place even had she been assassinated. It is also possible that such an event might have served as a catalyst for further revolt, dragging out the civil war longer, or resulting in the loss of even more Chelish territory.
Okay, is it just his imagination, or is the whole business with rightful heir to the throne by law and unquestionable legal right to rule not only a bit incongruous with there being a giant civil war and Abigail needing the Church of Asmodeus's support, but also the author possibly kind of quietly signaling that this fact which requires so much emphasis is maybe not actually true, in which case you could maybe also infer that it's illegal or otherwise threatened against to suggest that Abigail wasn't the rightful heir. And is it his imagination that this book is, not so much better written really as more informative, more alive-sounding, than the previous set of Chelish history books, or just more interesting somehow? And should Keltham be attributing that to the library having better book taste than the bookshop operator who stocked the book personally attacking Abigail Thrune, or to the conspiracy frantically upping the level of its game as it became clear Keltham wasn't happy with their earlier efforts? Keltham will read a few pages ahead, and then skip to randomly later in the book, and then read the page before that, whatever it is.
This excerpt has pages before and ahead. If he skips way ahead, they'll transition him to a different excerpt on a related topic. He lands in a discussion of the early stages of the modern Chelish education system, and the transition from a handful of private, paid establishments to a push towards public education available to the children of all subjects of the crown, which also has pages before and ahead of it.
Why is the crown not just offering to pay for skill mastery outcomes and letting anybody who wants to try their hand at producing those? Does governance not have any adversarially resistant way of measuring whether learning has occurred, such that if they offered to pay for learning, somebody would inevitably teach to the test without producing real human capital? And yet governance does think they have some adversarially resistant way of measuring process inputs to education, where those inputs inevitably produce learning, such that they can pay people to teach, but not pay for learning at all? Somehow, Keltham doubts that this is the case. In fact, he doubts that anybody in governance even thought about it in those terms. Somebody get a Seventh Circle priest of Abadar in here. Never pay for the input when you can pay for the output, and if you can't robustly measure outputs, you probably can't robustly measure inputs either, goes the saying out of Dath Ilan. It's still a good book, though. Is it for sale or borrowable?
He'll ask.
They don't have a second copy of that one at this time. 2 gold to commission 1.
What's the fastest you could get me a commissioned copy? If I commission a copy and pay triple, can I take this one just for today?
No, sir, because we'd be using this one to make the copy. At this point, Berlinger walks in. He's a plump elderly man whose eyebrows look a bit singed. Fenolosa, I hear you urgently need me for something?
Consultation on the books. It's a long story.
All right. Now he can try for more of a pattern of queries and answers that should be harder for Cheliacs to have completely covered by trying to write books in advance. Book with more detail on the specific aid provided by Asmodeus's church to Abergale, what concessions or policies they demanded in return. Does Berlinguer know where to locate something like that?
Military aid provided in the war? Here they've aggressively repurposed a lot of books about the original Chelish Civil War, where, thank hell, House Thrun was led by Abergale's grandmother, also named Abergale. The best source is Campaigns of the Chelish Civil War, which is in 2 volumes, should be right over here. He pulls them out. We also have Hell Shows Its Hand, which is much more popular, but I think worse, and Avastan's Queen. If you're interested in a more academic lens, I like a realist account of the Chelish civil conflict.
What exactly is a non-realist account? Never mind, let's just try the realist one.
He pulls it off a shelf. Realism is probably at your level of exposure best understood as the academic way of describing work that proceeds from the assumption that conflicts are incented, rather than ideological, that conflict arises where there's weakness and ends with an overwhelming show of strength. Someone analyzing the Chelish Civil War through an ideological lens would study the doctrine of the Asmodean Church and write about how it compares to the ideologies it displaced in appeal. Someone analyzing it through a realist lens would focus on how the Church succeeded in establishing the Queen as an absolute monarch by backing her up with the use of force. Sorry, no one explained to me. Who are you, and what's your urgent interest in this?
Don't ask, Fenolosa says tiredly.
I'm not a soldier anymore, young man. I'm allowed to be curious about things.
The banter is very well executed, but it won't help at all if he looks at the wrong book.
Keltham will open that one to a random place, read for 7 pages, return it. Keltham will then have the thought that next time he needs to just flip through a lot of pages rapidly, skimming just enough to verify rough continuity of text and subject, to avert the conspiracy being able to cheaply manufacture a bunch of short excerpts. Unfortunately, Keltham is juggling a lot of cognitive balls right now, and has temporarily forgotten the juggling ball that is the conspiracy reading his mind. He thinks about his next intention to read a lot of the book overtly, loudly enough that you could pick it up from his mind even if you weren't Abergale Thrun. Abergale's first major policy shifts during her early years, Keltham says.
Feed him something we have the complete book of.
There's exactly one book they have complete on even remotely that topic. It's on the shelf as Avastan's Queen and the early years of Abergale Thrun II's reign, and as the uncensored and thoroughly illegal history of the Chelish Civil War. They'll take the second one off the shelf for him.
Keltham will read a few pages for real, then, tell Fenolosa to, flip through pages starting from whatever they showed him, leaving each page spread to be scried only for 4 seconds or so for Keltham to skim speed read. He once wrote a computer program as a kid to help him learn to move his eyes faster, and was disgruntled to learn that when he followed the shifting blue word as fast as he couldn't understand what he'd read. Nonetheless, Keltham can skim pretty darn quickly if he wants to, and can still notice anomalies at that speed. Keltham will speed skim about 100 pages that way. They do all seem to be there. Wait, shit. He thought about that tactic before he did it.
Meanwhile, Asmodea is in a state of very calm total panic, considering what will probably be Keltham's obvious next move. He asks for particular topics, and then, after reading each excerpt, generates a random number to decide whether to spend 3 minutes skimming 100 pages from there. Asmodea is not in fact seeing a counter to this particular tactic. They can't just hand Keltham complete books open to different places each time, because even at the speed he's skimming, Keltham will notice if he reads ahead and sees that he's reading an excerpt he's already read. And then that just works. So far as Asmodia can see, Keltham wins. The conspiracy can't counter that unless they actually have that many completed books, and they don't. She can't think of any counter. Does Savar have a counter?
The books that are complete but just about Taldor with the names changed. There's a bunch of those. It's not likely to hold, though.
Asmodia can think of one desperate thing to try. She requests permission to gamble the entire mission. She has the gardens. She can suicide if this fails, and it's her fault. She does dare do this.
It's not like charging into this without a plan isn't gambling the whole mission. She should do what she thinks gives them the best odds, even if it makes failure more spectacular or more embarrassing.
Keltham, I have an idea that so far as I can tell means the conspiracy just loses. Am I supposed to tell you about it or wait for you to think of it? Because I don't have any way of knowing if you've already thought of it. And this idea seems to me like a strong test, even if the conspiracy thinks of it first. I could be missing something, of course. Because even if she can't solve it, maybe Keltham can.
Okay, sure, tell me that one.
I mean, possibly you already thought of it, because it seems pretty inevitable to me. The idea here is to check whether all the books actually exist, right? But if you only read a short way, they could be handing you much shorter fragments, since not all books are viable to check afterwards. If you try to read much longer than that, it takes a long time to do that check. Plus, if you intend to do it in advance, the conspiracy can read your mind about it. So go on asking for information about particular subjects, but then after you've gotten the answer to your question, generate a random number, like 1-6, and try to speed read that whole book if it comes up 6. They can't just hand you underlying real books open to different places each time, because even skimming really, really fast, you'd probably recognize if you reread something you already saw. So a library can't pass that test with high probability unless it actually has that many complete books.
Oh, okay. I probably would have gotten that one in another 20 seconds, because you're right, it seems pretty inevitable, but it's still a good idea, and it's good for me to know the conspiracy would see that tactic too. Does the proposal have any flaws? Keltham considers this problem mentally.
Asmodia almost, but not quite, prays to Odelmans about it. She remembers in time that sometimes her prayers get answered, and this wouldn't actually be a great time.
He's actually not seeing it offhand, if he uses a random number generation method that they can't plausibly predict. And picking a random number generation method that then uses some environmental entropy seems like a pretty powerful way of doing that, even in a low-tech environment that's reading your mind. For that matter, if there is some very clever way to defeat the proposal, he shouldn't think of it now, he should think of it afterwards. Maybe Asmodia asked that as a last-ditch desperate attempt by conspiracy to make him think of a solution to a problem they couldn't solve themselves. Though, also to be fair, that's sort of a nitwit clever tactic. He can't see conspiracy Asmodia actually being reckless enough to try. Okay, let's try that then.
There's an instant of spinning horror before Asmodia stops trying to see the world from Keltham's Dath Ilani viewpoint quite so hard, and remembers that she is of Golarion. Random numbers? Prophecy is broken, but it's not that broken. Auguries. Use auguries every time to check if it's the right time to hand him an excerpt. They're fallible, but if Keltham doesn't do too many checks, we'll have a chance of fooling him. If they've got no auguries prepped and no scrolls of those, then they're all going to die. But that won't be Asmodia's fault. She really felt like she was doing an unusually good job here, involving her taking some huge professional and hence personal risks that gave Cheliax the best chance it could have had, if other people did their parts and prepared adequately.
The facility has 3 auguries prepped daily, 2 for Project Lawful's use on weird experiments, 1 for actual security reserve. They've got a couple of scrolls of augury in storage as a backup to that. That's enough to check the next few cases while somebody teleports to Agorian and back to fetch more scrolls, ideally along with an arcane savant to cast from those scrolls. Asmodia continues to show promise, and yes, he appreciates that she risked herself there. But those other thoughts verge on attempted self-defense against punishment and would get her lit on fire most places that aren't Project Lawful.
Acknowledged, Asmodia thinks back at him. She'll go on being smug, just more privately.
Aspexia's spells, even the low-circle ones, are really quite valuable at her caster level. With few exceptions, she only requests spells from Lord Asmodeus that she plans to use that day. There's relatively little need for preparing against such contingencies by wasting your spell slots when you can afford to carry around a bag of holding containing, among a lot of other things, 24 augury scrolls.
Acknowledged. Belay the previous request for scrolls. Just get us the arcane savants. Auguries take a minute to cast, though. How are we?
Number the books Keltham requests. Do auguries in parallel across our clerics about the result of using an excerpt on Keltham's nth request. That should still work so long as the request and its consequences are within the half-hour prediction window.
All right, the library seems to be passing Asmodea's obvious testing method, so far.
They're getting some errors, but so far all of them have been of the form where they use a complete book and didn't really need to. So far.
At some point, Keltham's intuition informs him that he's gotten about as much evidence out of this as he could get. His randomized random number generators have fired 3 times, and 3 is well known to be the largest possible number. He's asked Fenalosa about ability to buy 6 books, and 3 of those have been for sale. All right, let's call it here. Next up is that.
Praised be Asmodeus. Also them. She's not going to think they're doing well, this is going to work out, because if she thinks that, it definitely won't. But she thinks they earned some sorely needed 2s there and will earn more from the erotica.
So, time to carry out exactly the same procedure on somebody's pornography collection. It doesn't feel like a deadly challenge to the conspiracy this time, more like, he basically knows that this test is going to be passed. Snack service wouldn't have suggested it otherwise, but still, sure, let's try it.
Fenalosa will go across town then at a brisk walk and declare himself calling in a favor owed to Lady Sally.
The illusionist might want to edit out the exchange that follows. You look Chelish.
Straight from the front. It's a long story.
Do you need anything?
Just the books.
How do you know Lady Sally?
Through Caden. Like I said, it's a long, long story.
But once that's worked out, Keltham can run his tests on the erotica collection.
It actually goes noticeably easier than trying to launch Chelish history queries. Mainly because Arnson Puddleton has read every one of the erotica books in his collection, to the point of doing better than a Dath Ilani computer's search index. For example, at one point, inspired by Carissa's idea about asking to interview children with poxmarks specifically, Keltham asks via Fenalosa if any of these books have a section where a masochist gets tied to a bed and then fed chocolate. Arnson cheerfully plucks one of his books off the shelf and promptly flips through to exactly that. Why Snack Service is allowed to help with this, but not...
Snack Service says it's decision theoretically complicated, and the more you think about it or try to draw implications from it, the less it's retroactively allowed to help you as much as it has already.
I wish to register that in the corresponding lessons in Dath Ilan, in which we do exotic thought experiments intended to teach us about this sort of theoretical possibility, the teacher always ends the lesson by reminding everyone that this has essentially never happened to anyone in real life throughout the entire history of time, and if you think it's happening to you, you're mistaken.
If you come up with any effective way to register things at Snack Service, let me know, because I've got things I'd also like to register.
And he's done. The conspiracy has done an even better job of making it look like masochists exist than making it look like Abigail is the ruler of Cheliax in cooperation with Asmodeus's church, which says something about their priorities, if nothing else. Keltham is sort of brain-tired at this point. Trying to think of all these things while not thinking of other things is sort of excessive for a mental control exercise. But, so long as Fenalosa is in Absalom, should Keltham be buying any scrolls that he could potentially use today? Delaying a while about that gives the conspiracy all sorts of chances to get up to all sorts of shenanigans, like trying to quickly write or complete the books Keltham bought. The conspiracy has a chance to claim that his scrolls can't be found at the next shop or 2 that Fenalosa tries, still potentially worth doing. They leak bits if nobody has sending, you'd expect that to be a very common spell. Some more purge invisibilities. An arcane sight, Keltham has kept wanting to watch himself hanging a spell already with his own arcane sight instead of a slightly delayed illusion. Well, no, he can requisition that later, if ordinary wins on review. But arcane sight is potentially useful against the conspiracy. Early judgment would be useful if anyone has that. It would give Keltham an emergency psychological buffer that doesn't take up a spell slot all the time. A psychological buffer that Keltham could very well need if things go poorly. Scrolls are expensive, But Keltham has some money and needs to be willing to spend some money here. He can afford a few low-level scrolls. Is he missing anything from his shopping list? Alarm X2, Detect Charm X4, those are first level and cheap. All of those together cost the same as 1 second circle scroll. Kinda crazy, really. Status, Dispel Magic, Suppress Charms and Compulsions, Lay of the Land, a backup Owl's Wisdom and a Fox's Cunning, both things he should have in emergencies, and it's not impossible today will turn into an emergency. Another Invisibility Purge, another Detect Intelligence accomplishes much the same thing, probably, and is cheaper. An Early Judgment, also because he might think of something to do with that. Some test. The conspiracy, if it exists, may be somehow nervous about afterlives. Though the fact that the conspiracy told him about that spell suggests that it has no obvious to them winnability. Well, they could have expected that his god would give it to him anyways at some point, before that whole interdiction zone happened. Keltham cannot really afford a sending or an extra glimpse of beyond, both fourth circle, with the amount he's already spending, or an arcane sight when he doesn't have a specific plan or time in mind to use it. Keltham doesn't really like spending large quantities of money. That is probably some kind of important character flaw given his changed life circumstances. He may have to work on this, but it will be a lot easier to work on this once he has those large amounts of money in his liquid asset account. Okay, he'll buy the arcane sight too. Fine.
Fenalosa will make all of these purchases. Such spells are available in Absalom, and it's be a loss of bits the conspiracy can't afford to pretend otherwise, and, well, either they've won or they've lost. At this point, it's likely beyond further manipulation. If Abigail concurs in that assessment, she might want her headband back. This feels like dying, but that, like all the rest of Carissa's feelings, are completely irrelevant.
I will not trust that this event is over until Keltham has arrived in a state of mind permitting us to statue him or left for Osirion. Myalol. Have you made progress on determining the conditions for that, under our Lord's will?
Mayol does not complain about impossibilities or his own incapacity. He simply reports what he can. If Keltham returns to a state where he is not, actively determining whether to leave us, especially for Osirion, through planned deeds that have not yet been performed and resolved themselves, if Keltham is not holding concrete plans to decide about that matter the next day, at a particular time, or if he's made whatever decisions he intends to make and has become again our indefinite guest, then Maliol thinks they would no longer be in the ambiguous fringes of Asmodeus's command. It is not clear to Maliol that they have been definitely commanded not to statue Keltham now, for just a year, while Keltham hasn't yet made a decision to depart but has decided to make a decision about it. The stakes here are unusually, exceptionally high.
Your report is heard. Listen and be educated, fool. It is likely that our Lord was paid for some outcome less stringent than this, in one regard or another, in the negotiations as of between gods, and yet our Lord issued us such stringent orders as these, because of the past tendency of fools like you to try to work around the edges of his instructions. Do you behave so now, our Lord will learn, and his expectations shift, and the next time he sells an expectation to gods, he will have to use yet more stringent instructions. Were I the sort to behave so, our Lord would have predicted that and issued even more stringent orders originally. Keep firmly to our Lord's directions and path when he has given orders. Obey him strictly, and do not try to work his interests around his orders' edges. Yes, even if it is in his interests. For that is not his way and his nature as a god, and when we work counter to that, we become less visible to his eyes, more slippery to his hands, more costly for him to manipulate.
Acknowledged Most High.
When his shopping is done, Fenalosa teleports back to just outside the Forbiddance, steps into it, and starts unpacking his fairly absurd collection of books and scrolls from Absalom as quickly as possible.
Dare we hope for a verdict, or are you going to need to read all the books and check over our math problems and so on first?
Second one. Ferrer, I'm taking all that stuff into a rope trick just outside the Forbiddance. I do not mind you stationing a lot of security around the entrance, but obviously, please don't send anybody inside unless it's a huge and frankly improbable emergency. Oh, and I'll want the transcript of the trip. And Fenalosa of the Ordinary World, thank you on behalf of myself and Cheliax for going through all that. It meant a lot. It hasn't been explained to Fenellosa what the ordinary qualifier means. Keltham doesn't think, but the sentiment is sincere.
Fenellosa is hard to read, but he looks slightly confused and slightly exasperated. I serve where I am commanded, he says flatly.
Well, Keltham has now spent enough time around Pilar to have any idea of what's going on there. And I expect your Lord Asmodeus appreciates that. Just saying, I do too. Keltham will quickly go get some things from his bedroom, like Ione's borrowed books among other things, and then cast his rope trick.
If he throws an alarm and an invisibility purge, he shouldn't notice someone who is gaseous and also turned into the fingernail-sized species of tropical bat. But they'll have to wait to go in until he uses Glimpse of Truth, or plan to rapidly leave when he forms the intent to do so. The key to winning is trying harder than anyone has any reason to suspect you can.
A rope trick resembles a box about 12 feet by 12 feet by 12 feet. It's dark. It has a window in the floor 3 feet by 5 feet, from which the world it's connected to is visible. Keltham can see security pacing anxiously under the entrance, and Carissa sitting down on the grass to run her fingers through it and look up at the sky, like someone who doesn't get the chance to do that much.
Once he's up there with his stuff, Keltham casts the alarm spell on the space, from Scroll. Keltham has spent a noticeable chunk of his salary on practicing with practice scrolls. It's a huge power amplifier if you've got money, and he expects to have money. Keltham considers only then if there's more he can do to protect the space, and then starts to prestidigitate the air around him, forming fragile shapes from it, as ordinary wizards may also do, even not knowing what they're doing, just binding air molecules together to form a very fragile solid. By this means, Keltham lays down a screen over the opening to the ground below, fine enough that it will let through air, and very little else. He casts Invisibility Purge, also from Scroll. When nothing then appears, Keltham carefully lies down, in a position he's going to keep for a while, and Keltham fills the whole volume except himself with fragile strands, webs that would shatter, visibly, at a touch. The conspiracy can probably still beat that, with a nation's resources, but he's hopefully made it a bit hard for them. Keltham needs very much to lie down and rest for a time.
Carissa finds herself suddenly with lots of excess cognitive capacity and wisdom not being employed for the project, which does not feel like a stable state to be in. She'll review the last-ditch fake escape plans and alter the earrings, and try very hard not to think any thoughts she won't be able to keep thinking once the headband's off.
Alter Asmodia would be tired after all this, and would be found in her bedroom trying to take a short break herself, not sitting beside Sivar. So Asmodia staggers off to her bedroom, in case Keltham runs right out of his rope trick to check on her, and lies down in her own bed. She really is a little tired after that. Asmodia wishes that she could blank her mind. There's probably a Dath Ilani discipline for it, and it's probably considered dangerous to teach to children because they'll hurt themselves. They should have been so much more prepared. Before this, she should have just told the Chelish Imperium up front that she was taking all of their writers and permanently exposing them to the truths of history only Corva was cleared for, and they just have to train new writers and put them on nothing except producing and altering enough books to have a chance of fooling Keltham. Is that hindsight bias? Was there something else Keltham could have tried, just as likely in foresight? Maybe Asmodia wouldn't have seen through to Keltham's ideas about forcing Cheliax to create too much information too quickly. Maybe she would have focused on the possibility of an Ostenso visit. An Ostenso visit probably would have helped win some twos. Maybe she was supposed to have closed the Ostenso ports, redirected most of the traffic elsewhere, or she was supposed to have fake ships ready for the Ostenso ports and have rehearsed everyone in Ostenso already. Or just have already built a fake Ostenso. One of her superiors should have told her if Asmodia was allowed to play with nation-level resources to do her job. One of her superiors should have told her if those points were so obvious in advance to everyone, and not just in hindsight. That's what she'll say if she's questioned about it. She'll try to explain about the law governing that, how only Ilani are trained to counteract hindsight bias, how only their keepers can do it indistinguishably, how, without training, children often can't counteract it at all. Maybe she'll leave out the part about Dath Ilani children. If something this stressful had happened to her, that also happened to Alter Asmodia, She'd ask Keltham to just hold her, that night, and be a warm thing for her. Asmodia wishes she could just rest her head on somebody's shoulder, at least. Somebody who was safe to be around and wouldn't hurt her or hold her in contempt for being that pathetic. If Keltham leaves, she won't have that from him anymore. It's only then that she remembers that she was supposed to be secretly hoping that Keltham would win.
Carissa is not letting herself do a failure analysis. Not yet. It seems like a very dangerous thing to do with this crown on. She's also not letting herself estimate the odds that they've won or lost, apparently. She keeps flinching away when she tries.
Asmodia's thoughts have wandered to how she could breach to Corva the subject of her being Asmodia's replacement snuggling partner. They're both probable asexuals, so it should be safe, right? Asmodia is Corva's superior, but she doesn't actually want an unwilling snuggling partner. Asmodia does have detect thoughts and some proficiency with it. It was a very useful spell at Ostenso Academy. Asmodia could just order Corva to fail her will save, to determine how Corva really feels about a proposal like that. No, that's a bit overt and aggressive. Corva might not like that. Asmodia will just order security to read Corva's mind about it when the subject comes up and report to Asmodia. That seems less likely to offend Corva, if security can do it without Corva noticing. It feels like Corva couldn't replace Keltham any more than Keltham could replace Corva. "Hey," Asmodia says into her telepathic bond. "I notice that I've seemed to start actually caring about Keltham, in the sense that the thought of not being able to snuggle Keltham anymore feels bad, and it doesn't feel like anyone else could actually replace him about that. I register that this matches a correct, purely trope-based prediction that I made earlier about what would happen to me by the time we needed to run a fake escape plan. I predict that any fake escape plan is going to fail unless it has at least me and Ione, possibly Yaisha. I'm not sure somebody needs to read her mind about it. Everyone who started actually caring about Keltham. The tropes won't let it work otherwise."
That sure does sound wildly self-serving, Carissa notices distantly. Also, if we're going to use that style of reasoning, which we probably shouldn't, then any escape plan obviously needs Carissa. She's the one Keltham's scared of losing. The problem is that it's much easier to sell Keltham on Ione and Tonya being innocents than on Asmodia and Carissa. The other problem is that the escape plan is very obviously doomed. She's going to try it anyway, not much to lose, but while she's refusing to generate a probability estimate about whether they've lost already, her brain is happy to generate one for whether the fake escape will work, and the answer it produces is no chance in hell.
I'll also register for what it's worth that an escape plan probably involves an apparently unconscious and stunned Seaver being carted along with him in magic-neutralizing handcuffs or something. She's the only one Keltham is truly afraid of losing. His thoughts said that, over and over. And any fake escape plan has probability practically zero of fooling Keltham unless he wants to be fooled. Desperately wants it. Needs it, to the point where he doesn't want to use Dathilani disciplines to know better. If he's already lost his Carissa, we might as well not bother, is my sense.
Then we want to interrupt him before he has, emotionally, already resigned himself to losing me. She lies down on the grass and looks up at the sky. She's kind of worried about what feelings she's going to have once she stops trying not to have feelings.
"We can put you to sleep for a brief time, Chosen, if you'd rather not think."
Let's run through the fake escape one more time, see if we can poke any more holes in it. Then, it feels like admitting weakness. But perhaps it's better to admit weakness than to pretend you possess strength you don't.
Keltham sits up. He didn't sleep, and didn't much succeed at quieting his own thoughts. There are disciplines for that, but it seemed like the wrong time, the wrong situation, to use them. Part of his brain sure does seem sad about how the day went. Is this possibly probability-theoretic nonsense? Keltham took a fairly hard run at the conspiracy. That could have broken a veil, if there'd been a veil there. No such blatant break occurred. On some very basic level, that ought to count in favor of ordinary, not against it. And he should be less emotionally worried about conspiracy than he was this morning. Does Keltham's brain buy this? Nope. Why is that Keltham's brain? Apparently, his brain thought he was supposed to get stronger first-order evidence for ordinary than he was able to get, and his failure to get that first-order evidence second-order weighs against ordinary. Can his brain possibly give an example of what that expected first-order evidence was supposed to look like? It looks like the booksellers having a broad selection of Chelish history books, right away. Rather than that having to wait for the library after the conspiracy has had a chance to frantically produce a lot of new books, half of which aren't for sale or borrowable. It looks like they're not being totally logical and rational in-universe reasons why a visit to Ostenso has to wait until tomorrow. Or the first bookseller's book, Critical of Cheliax, sounding a bit more like the book Critical of Kadira. This does not seem like it quantitatively justifies a major increase in despair brain. These are not things that must happen in the ordinary universe. It just felt on an intuitive level like what was going on today was Keltham failing to pierce the veil and not finding decisive evidence, not like he was walking freely around in a world where no veil existed. You know, if there's an actual conspiracy, they're probably going to be pretty annoyed if Keltham ends up walking out on them for reasons like that. What, is the conspiracy supposed to think that we should now resolve this battle fairly, determining in a lawful way who won the contest, by iterating through all the events of the day, multiplying together the likelihood ratios we assigned at the time, multiplying by whatever prior we previously assigned, and coming to a decision on that basis? At least Conspiracy Asmodia has to know better than that. Or Conspiracy Carissa. It's not like we haven't told them that the rule, even for small cases, is to make up a prior and a likelihood ratio, multiply them together to get a posterior, and then throw that number out and go with your intuitive feeling once you've forced your brain to actually ask all of the correct questions. And this is a huge case, involving a huge number of conditional dependencies between all of the things going on. You can't just take the likelihoods your busy brain was making up without keeping running track of how the most likely conspiracy and ordinary universes were shifting with each update, and multiply all of those likelihoods together. They know that too. Finally, if there's an actual conspiracy on the other side of this, we are absolutely not supposed to be having a fair fight with them. We should just boost wisdom, and possibly also cunning, try to focus just on this one issue, and then if that starts to go wrong, quickly drop out of the rope trick and ask for an emergency dispel. Well, part of him sure definitely thinks that if he does that, it means he never gets to see Carissa again. Yeah, okay, enough of that. Let's just actually walk through the evaluation of the evidence from today, and from all other days. Keltham forgot, in fact, to cast Detect Intelligence, where he could verify that it just detected intelligence scores, or get Detect Intentions cast on him by that security. Keltham is willing, however, to expect that this test would go the way that the conspiracy said it would. And if Keltham casts Detect Intelligence afterwards, and it's hugely anomalous, he can change his conclusions then. So step 1 is to review Carissa's and Asmodia's math homework, the other researchers' conspiracy homework, and skim a random selection of the books that were actually bought or borrowed. Just do his own homework first. The longer he delays before doing that, the more time the conspiracy has to finish the half-written books and transform the ones he has in here, using their 8th circle wizardry that can in fact go right through a rope trick.
Well, it's not trivial. Even with 8th circle wizardry, Manohar is presently a gaseous housefly clinging to the bottom of Keltham's screen, just inside the rope trick, having been polymorphed by polymorph any object rather than greater polymorph as it lasts longer. Every half hour he has to fly out and get the polymorph suppressed so he can recast Detect Thoughts and have gaseous form recast on him. More frequently than that, he flies down an inch to deliver a situation report.
Unfortunately for anybody who didn't want to think about probabilities, Asmodia has now realized something else they totally forgot to do today. They should have been running a prediction market and a conditional prediction market this whole time. So now Asmodia is setting up a quick prediction market about the chance that the primary deception around Keltham shatters, and a secondary conditional prediction market about the chances that different versions of the backup escape plan work, further conditional on those becoming necessary. Asmodia's opening bid is 80% that the primary deception shatters before tonight, before they can turn Keltham into a statue for a year, with the second condition winning if there's a difference between them. Keltham just has too much information, is Asmodia's guess. His thoughts about the conspiracy were starting to track too closely to what was actually going on around him. He's not limited to the information from today. He also has evidence from when the conspiracy was younger and less practiced. They don't just have to quell his doubts. They have to quell his doubts far enough that Keltham decides not to try an owl's wisdom. And then, Asmodia is thinking, taps himself with Fox's cunning once the owl's wisdom makes him realize that's the wise thing to do. Keltham has by now had a chance to demonstrate to Asmodia that some of her probabilities were a tad overconfident. Asmodia's intuitive guess was 90%, and would have been 95% without that demonstration and some amount of correction of intuition. 80% is her weaker second-order probability after trying to compensate for her remaining intuitive overconfidence. So 80%. Any bidders? And Asmodia is basically not betting that the main unfixed version of the backup escape plan works. She'll sell anything over 10% on that, if there's any bidders. But she would maybe bid like 5% or 10% on a plan working, if it involves at least Ione and Asmodia and Carissa in anti-magic handcuffs. Okay, actually, Asmodia needs the Queen or the Most High to sign off on telling bettors that, in the event the primary deception fails and the backup fake escape plan doesn't work, they aren't all going to be executed and will remain in a state to have some use for money afterwards. Because otherwise, people are placing bids at probabilities that do not make any sense. Here is Asmodia's mind being totally sincere about how much she did not cleverly plan that, and just legitimately tried to do this obvious thing, that they obviously ought to do, and then ran into herself not being able to do that correctly because people were scared. She is not trying to extort any promises out of anybody. It just looks to her like Cheliax would obviously continue to have use for Project Lawful either way, and is not going to kill off 1/10 of all the security officers in Cheliax, and if Asmodia is right about that, it would be useful to the betting market to say so.
Diminished Abigail wishes she could sleep away the moments before she gets her crown returned. Ply 4 + 4 + 4 is not 2/3 of her crown. But she would be less defended then, even with the Most High standing guard over herself. To remain awake and also guard herself is the wiser course, to preserve herself and her throne. So Abigail endures. It is good for a soul now and then to suffer and endure. Abigail probably receives too little of that to keep herself strong. There are emotions in her, harder to keep in rein and check than they would be with her crown worn. This creature of Aspexia's will needs some correction at some point, in Abigail's own opinion. But also the little creature is sincere on her surfaces, and she is correct that people are being stupid. I was not, in fact, planning to execute a huge number of the most valuable people in Cheliax, who only failed me and did not betray me, who will be needed whatever comes of this. You will not receive any promises from me on the subject, fools, but I was not planning to be stupid. I currently expect you will have some use for money in the future, either way. That is all.
Carissa is at this point half occupied in her own mind, tying up knots, trying not to think about things that it's probably not wise to think about, and is not going to let her mind go anywhere near the question of what's going to happen to her after she fails, if she fails. But it seems kind of obvious to her that you should bet with the actual odds you think are correct, so they are slightly more likely to succeed at this, whether you think you're going to be executed or not.
Unfortunately, several Chelish security have now realized that money is more valuable to them if the deception around Keltham fails, because they will get less rich if the project is not a total success. Nobody is reading their minds about this, and it's going to look to Asmodia just like security is overconfident in their pessimism because they didn't get anti-overconfidence lessons.
Well, I have good news for you.
Guards, throw this imposter out. Meranre never has good news for me.
Keltham's about to see through them. Well, 90% that Keltham's about to see through them, if Chelish people understand how making predictions works. Though if they did, hard to fathom they'd go on being Chelish people. Are we ready?
For Keltham, yes. For a war with Cheliax, readier than we'll be in a month. For whatever's actually going to happen, I doubt it. But gods, at least he'll have the truth.
If you wish to support this AI reading and others like it, please visit patreon.com/AskWhoCastsAI. Any help is appreciated. And thank you to executive producer John Doe 7776059.